In the frozen dawn of January 15th of 1945, when the Soviet artillery echoed across the Polish countryside and German officers burned documents by the crate, Elias Friedman, a 42-year-old watchmaker from Prague, watched as the SS guards assembled 10,000 skeletal prisoners in the snow outside Auschwitz. The thermometer had registered 34 degrees below zero during the night, cold enough to freeze diesel fuel in the tanks of German trucks. The wind cut through threadbare striped uniforms like bayonets through flesh, and the sound of boots crunching on ice mingled with the labored breathing of men who weighed less than 80 pounds. Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann raised his Luger and fired a single shot that dropped an elderly man who could not stand any longer, the report echoing across the assembly ground like judgment. The man's blood steamed briefly in the snow before freezing into crimson crystals that would eventually vanish beneath the boots of those forced to march past his body. Hannah Berkowitz photographed the columns from behind a distant farmhouse, capturing the most harrowing forced evacuation the Western Front had ever witnessed, her fingers nearly frozen to the metal of her camera as she documented what many would later deny had ever happened. This is the story of how the Nazi regime transformed retreat into mobile extermination chambers stretching hundreds of miles, where guards competed to devise new methods of torture that would leave no evidence for Allied investigators. 23 of those officers were never prosecuted for crimes that defy belief. Subscribe now to discover what declassified Soviet documents finally revealed about the officers who turned highways into killing fields, and why the Americans suppressed evidence that would have shocked even Nuremberg prosecutors. The eastern horizon glowed faintly orange, a false promise of warmth on that January morning. Elias Friedman pressed his cracked and bleeding fingers against his mouth, trying to trap whatever heat his breath might provide. Around him, 9,999 other prisoners stood in rigid rows, their emaciated bodies swaying slightly in the bitter wind that swept across the assembly ground of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero overnight, cold enough to freeze the moisture in a man's lungs if he breathed too deeply. 3 weeks earlier, they had heard the distant thunder of Soviet artillery for the first time. Now that thunder had grown closer, more insistent, a metallic promise of either liberation or death. Elias had once been a watchmaker of considerable reputation in Prague, his fingers nimble enough to manipulate the tiny gears and springs that kept time for the city's elite. Now those same fingers were swollen, the nails blackened from frostbite, barely able to grip the thin fabric of his striped uniform. He had entered Auschwitz weighing 165 pounds. This morning, he estimated he weighed less than 90. Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann strode through the rows, his SS uniform immaculate despite the early hour and the chaos of the previous days. His boots were polished to a mirror shine that seemed to mock the prisoner's bare, frost-bitten feet. Behind him walked 4 other SS officers, each carrying lists and firearms. Hoffmann was 34 years old, with pale blue eyes that revealed nothing and hands that never trembled, not even in the biting cold. Before the war, he had been a university administrator in Munich, a man of education and culture who played Bach on the violin and quoted Goethe in conversation. Now he administered death with the same methodical precision, his education serving only to refine his cruelty. The night before, Hoffmann had burned personnel files in the camp office, selecting which records to destroy and which to take westward. He had been careful to eliminate evidence of the most egregious medical experiments while preserving documentation of labor allocations that might prove useful to the Reich's continuing war effort. As he worked, he had sipped cognac from a crystal glass, occasionally pausing to warm himself by the fire consuming evidence of thousands of murders. "The camp is being evacuated," Hoffmann announced in German, his voice carrying across the assembly ground. "We march west. Anyone who cannot keep pace, anyone who attempts to escape, will be shot immediately." He did not need to elaborate. The prisoners had witnessed enough executions to understand the simple equation. Strength equals survival. Elias looked to his left where David Katz stood, a former mathematics professor from Berlin who had become his closest friend during their 11 months of imprisonment. David's cheekbones protruded sharply beneath paper-thin skin, and his eyes had sunk deep into their sockets. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, the result of a guard's rifle butt when he had been caught sharing bread with an elderly prisoner last autumn. The 2 men had survived together through summer work details and winter starvation. They had shared scraps of food and whispered conversations after dark, clinging to humanity in a place designed to eradicate it. In the before time, that seemingly mythical period prior to trains and selections and striped uniforms, David had taught advanced calculus at the University of Berlin. His papers on number theory had been published internationally. His students had included children of Nazi officials, who now might be among the very SS men preparing to march them west. Sometimes in the barracks at night, David would explain mathematical concepts to Elias, sketching equations in the dirt floor with a stick, insisting that the mind must remain active even as the body failed. It was their private rebellion, To think, to learn, to share knowledge in a place where intellect was as despised as their ethnicity. "Stay close to me," Elias whispered. "We survive together." David nodded almost imperceptibly. "West means away from the Russians," he whispered back. "They're running." A gunshot cracked the frozen air. 20 yards away, an elderly man had collapsed to his knees, unable to remain standing after hours in the cold. Lieutenant Hoffman stood over him, Luger still raised, a thin curl of smoke drifting from the barrel. He holstered his weapon without looking at the body and continued his inspection of the rows. The first column began moving at 7:30 in the morning. Elias and David found themselves in the fourth column, nearly 3,000 people ahead of them shuffling through the camp's main gate. As they passed beneath the infamous Arbeit macht frei sign, Elias forced himself not to look up at the twisted irony of those words. Work had not set anyone free. Work had only prolonged the suffering. Outside the camp, the narrow road stretched westward between snow-covered fields. SS guards flanked the columns, some on foot, others on horseback, all heavily armed. German shepherds strained at their leashes, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The guards had been issued winter coats, gloves, proper boots. The prisoners had nothing but the striped cotton uniforms that had been their only clothing for months or years. Hannah Berkowitz observed the procession from her position behind a dilapidated farmhouse 500 yards from the road. A 29-year-old Polish Jew who had escaped from a transport train 2 years earlier, she had joined a small resistance cell operating in the countryside around Oświęcim. The scar across her palm where she had cut herself while breaking through the train car's wooden floor had faded to a thin white line, a permanent reminder of her narrow escape from the fate now befalling these thousands. Hannah had been a photographer before the war, documenting life in Warsaw's vibrant Jewish community for newspapers and family portraits. When the Germans came, she had used those same skills to create false identity papers that helped dozens escape the ghetto. Now, her artistic eye served a grimmer purpose, documenting atrocity with the cold precision of someone who understood that beauty and horror often shared the same frame. Today, her assignment was documentation. The small Leica camera concealed beneath her coat had been parachuted in by British intelligence 6 months earlier. Its film canisters, precious as gold, were wrapped in oilskin and buried in various locations throughout the forest, insurance against capture. Each roll contained 24 potential pieces of evidence that might someday hold the perpetrators accountable. "They're emptying the camp completely," whispered Tomasz, the former schoolteacher who led their cell. "Thousands of them." Hannah raised the camera carefully, focusing on the endless line of prisoners. "The world needs to see this," she replied, her finger pressing the shutter button. The soft click seemed dangerously loud in the stillness, though she knew the sound could not possibly carry to the road. This cannot be forgotten. The first day of marching covered 22 miles. By sunset, over 400 prisoners lay dead along the route, their bodies collecting snow in roadside ditches. Some had been shot after collapsing from exhaustion. Others had simply fallen and never risen, their hearts giving out after years of malnutrition and abuse. Still others had attempted escape, darting toward the tree line only to be cut down by machine gun fire, their blood steaming briefly in the snow before freezing into crimson crystals. The SS guards made no effort to record their names or numbers. These deaths were not worthy of documentation. Lieutenant Hoffman had developed a system for disposing of bodies that fell too close to the road. Every half mile, prisoners were selected to drag corpses into the woods and cover them with branches and snow. These cleanup details were themselves often executed after completing their task, eliminating witnesses and reducing the column's size simultaneously. The guards called it efficiency management, joking amongst themselves that this was the only kind of management that required no paperwork. Obersturmführer Werner Schmidt, Hoffman's adjutant, had suggested an innovation on the second hour of the march. Prisoners who slowed the column's pace would be forced to remove their shoes and continue barefoot. "The cold will take them quickly," he explained with clinical detachment, "and it leaves no evidence of direct killing." Hoffman had approved the measure with a nod, and soon dozens of prisoners were stumbling forward on bare feet that turned from angry red to bloodless white as tissue dyed. The guards collected the confiscated shoes in a wagon, considering them valuable Reich property to be redistributed. Elias and David remained together, sometimes linking arms for support when one or the other stumbled. They did not speak much. Speech required energy, and energy was the most precious resource they possessed. Instead, they focused on the simple mechanics of movement. Place one foot in front of the other, ignore the pain, repeat. Their world narrowed to this singular task. That first night, the columns stopped near a small village whose name neither man caught. There was no shelter provided. The prisoners were herded into an open field and surrounded by guards. No food was distributed. Some prisoners managed to scoop up handfuls of snow to quench their thirst, but many were too weak to bend down without falling. From a nearby farmhouse, lights glowed warmly in windows curtained against the night. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the tantalizing scent of cooking across the field. The juxtaposition was deliberate. SS officers had commandeered the farmhouse for their quarters, ensuring the prisoners could see comfort just beyond their reach. Inside, the officers ate hot stew and black bread while drinking schnapps, occasionally glancing through the windows at the mass of humanity freezing slowly outside. The Polish family who owned the farm had been given 15 minutes to vacate before being marched at gunpoint to a neighboring property. The mother had tried to take a pot of soup to distribute to the prisoners, but had been struck in the face with a rifle butt for her efforts. Her children watched from hiding as she spat blood into the snow, then gathered her dignity and led them away without looking back. This small act of defiance went unrecorded in any official history, but was witnessed by David Katz, who happened to be looking in the right direction at the right moment. "We need to sleep in shifts," David whispered as they huddled together for warmth. "One awake, one asleep." Elias nodded. "I'll watch first." Around them, 10,000 breathing scarecrows arranged themselves on the frozen ground. Some formed tight circles, pressing together for warmth. Others sat alone, rocking back and forth, lost in private worlds of suffering. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. By morning, nearly 200 prisoners had frozen to death in their sleep. Lieutenant Hoffman walked among the bodies at dawn, casually nudging them with his boot to confirm death. His adjutant, a young officer named Werner Schmidt, followed with a clipboard, making occasional notations. Not counting the dead, recording the remaining living, resources to be managed. "We should have shot more of them yesterday," Schmidt remarked. "Those who can barely walk slow the entire column." Hoffman glanced at him. "Orders are to deliver as many as possible to Gross-Rosen. The Reich still needs labor." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the transport of cattle or machinery rather than human beings. "Besides, the cold will thin them out efficiently enough. The Russians will find these bodies," Schmidt pointed out, gesturing to the field of corpses. "By then, it won't matter." Hoffman checked his watch. "Prepare the columns. We move in 30 minutes. The second day was worse than the first. Prisoners who had somehow maintained strength through the initial march now began to falter, muscles seized after the night spent on frozen ground. Frostbitten extremities turned black and gangrenous. Those who had survived by maintaining a delicate balance between minimal nourishment and physical exertion found that balance impossible to sustain under the new demands. Elias felt the first symptoms of dysentery around noon on that second day. His stomach cramped violently and cold sweat broke out across his forehead, despite the freezing temperature. He said nothing to David, knowing there was no remedy, no respite. Stopping meant death. Admission of illness meant death. The only path forward was to endure. 3 miles ahead of them, Jakob Rosenberg could endure no more. A 60-year-old tailor from Krakow, who had survived 2.5 years in Auschwitz, he collapsed in the middle of the road, his legs finally betraying him. The column parted around his prone figure like water around a stone. An SS guard approached, drew his pistol without breaking stride, and fired a single shot into the back of Jakob's head before continuing forward. No pause in the column's movement, no acknowledgement of the life ended. Hannah Berkowitz and her resistance cell had been following the death march at a careful distance, using forest paths and farm tracks to parallel the main road without being spotted. They had with them a horse-drawn cart disguised as a farmer's wagon, loaded with straw, beneath which were concealed medical supplies, blankets, and food. "We can't save all of them," Tomasz had explained the previous night. "But when darkness falls, we'll try to reach those who fall behind or hide in the woods. We can get some to safety." Hannah nodded, though the math was brutal and undeniable. Their small cell might save 12 prisoners at most. 10,000 had left Auschwitz. "Every life matters," she said finally, "even one." By the third day, the columns had fractured into several disjointed groups. The strongest prisoners had pulled ahead, while those barely clinging to life fell increasingly behind. The SS guards maintained their positions, flanking the procession, but the neat order of the initial departure had disintegrated into a ragged stream of suffering humanity stretching for miles along the road. Lieutenant Hoffman rode on horseback now, moving up and down the column to maintain control. His frustration grew as the organizational structure broke down. Reports reached him of small groups of prisoners disappearing into the woods under cover of darkness. Local Polish civilians occasionally appeared at the roadside, sometimes throwing bread to the marchers before being chased away or shot by the guards. "This is becoming untenable," he remarked to Schmidt as they conferred near a crossroads. "At this rate, we'll lose half of them before reaching Gross-Rosen." "Perhaps that's not unintentional," Schmidt suggested carefully. "Higher command must know that many won't survive this journey. Perhaps that's part of the purpose." Hoffman considered this, then nodded slowly. "Yes, emptying the camps without the evidence of mass execution. The bodies spread across hundreds of miles rather than concentrated in one location." He straightened in his saddle. "Very well. We maintain pace. Those who fall, fall. The cynical efficiency of this realization spread through the officer ranks. The death march was not merely a relocation of prisoners. It was an extermination method designed to leave evidence scattered and diffuse, harder to quantify, harder to prosecute after the war that Germany was now clearly losing. On the fourth day, as they approached a small town called Vshchina, Elias found himself increasingly unable to maintain pace. The dysentery had weakened him severely. He had not been able to keep down the meager bread ration distributed the previous evening, and dehydration made his head spin with each step. "David," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I can't." David gripped his arm tighter. "You can. One more step, then another. Leave me. Save yourself." "No." David's voice was firm despite his own exhaustion. "We made a promise. Together." 20 yards ahead of them, a prisoner stumbled and fell to his knees. An SS guard approached, rifle raised. Instead of the expected gunshot, however, something unexpected happened. The guard glanced around quickly, then leaned down and spoke a few words to the fallen man. He helped the prisoner to his feet and shoved him roughly back into the column. Elias blinked, wondering if his feverish mind was hallucinating. "Did you see?" David nodded almost imperceptibly. "Not all of them are monsters. Remember that?" This small act of mercy was an anomaly in an ocean of cruelty, but it lodged in Elias's mind, a fragile talisman to cling to. If one guard could choose humanity, perhaps others might as well. Perhaps survival was not entirely a matter of strength, but also of fortune, the fortune of which guard happened to notice when you fell. As night approached on the fourth day, a heavy snow began to fall. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the temperature plummeted further. The columns ground to a halt near a cluster of abandoned farm buildings. The prisoners were once again ordered to arrange themselves in an open field. But this time, the snowfall provided a strange blessing, a blanket of insulation against the killing cold of the bare ground. Elias and David found a position against a low stone wall that offered minimal protection from the wind. They brushed away as much snow as they could and sat with their backs against the rough stones, shoulders touching. "If we reach Gross Rosen," David whispered, "what then?" "Another camp, more work, more waiting." "For what?" Elias had no answer. The endpoint of their suffering remained as obscure and distant as ever. Liberation by Allied forces, death from exhaustion, selection for execution, all seemed equally possible, equally out of their control. In the darkness nearby, someone was reciting Kaddish in a barely audible murmur, the prayer for the dead. Neither Elias nor David had been particularly observant before the war, but the familiar Hebrew words floated through the snowy air like a connection to a world that now seemed mythical in its distance. Yitgadal v'yit kadash shmei rabbah. They did not join in speaking, but they listened, and in listening found a thread of connection to their past selves, to the communities that had been systematically destroyed, to millennia of ancestors who had endured their own sufferings and still found words to sanctify existence. The voice belonged to Rabbi Mendel Horowitz, once the spiritual leader of a congregation in Lodz, now reduced to bones held together by will and faith. His beard, once full and black, had turned white during his 2 years in Auschwitz, not from age, but from the systematic erasure of everything he had once been. Yet each night he recited the ancient prayers, not just Kaddish for the dead, but Shema as well, affirming the oneness of God, even as creation shattered around him. Some prisoners found his devotion incomprehensible in the face of such horror. Others drew strength from it, whispering "Amen" when he finished, clinging to ritual as the last framework standing in a collapsing world. At dawn, Rabbi Horowitz was found frozen, his body curled around a young boy he had tried to keep warm through the night. His prayer shawl, somehow preserved through years of imprisonment, was wrapped around both of them, a final act of dignity and protection in a place designed to strip both away. The boy, Avram Lewenthal, age 14, survived. The guards who discovered them kicked the rabbi's body aside, but allowed the boy to continue with the column, perhaps because his youth made him still valuable as potential labor, perhaps because of random mercy in a sea of calculated cruelty. Years later, as a professor of theology in Jerusalem, Avram would write a seminal work on faith after the Holocaust, dedicating it to the rabbi whose last act had been one of protective love rather than self-preservation. What I remember most clearly, Avram would later testify, was not the physical cold, which was beyond description, but the way Rabbi Horowitz continued to speak of God as present even in that frozen field. He whispered to me that night that suffering does not negate divinity, but rather calls it forth in human action, that God was present in every shared crust of bread, every supported step, every whispered comfort. When I felt his body grow still before dawn, I believed I had witnessed the death of faith itself. It took me 30 years to understand that I had instead witnessed its ultimate expression. Morning brought no respite. Those who survived the night were forced to their feet by guards using rifle butts and boots. No food was distributed, no water. The only sustenance was snow scooped from the ground by those strong enough to bend without falling. SS officers moved through the makeshift camp with a mechanical precision that characterized the Nazi bureaucracy of death, checking boxes on clipboards, counting the living, ignoring the dead except as logistical problems to be managed. The 5th day of the march brought new horrors. The snowfall had stopped during the night, leaving a pristine white landscape that contrasted grotesquely with the columns of filthy, starving prisoners who resumed their westward movement at dawn. Many who had lain down the previous evening did not rise. The field was dotted with human-shaped mounds under fresh snow. SS officers moved through the makeshift camp, kicking at the forms that didn't stir on their own. Occasionally, a snow-covered bundle would groan or move feebly. Sometimes these signs of life were enough to earn a reprieve. The prisoner would be roughly hauled to their feet and shoved into the forming columns. Other times, the officers decided the prisoner was too weak to continue and administered the mercy of a bullet. Lieutenant Hoffman observed this process with clinical detachment. The numbers continued to dwindle. Out of the original 10,000, fewer than 7,000 remained. Reports from other death marches departing from camps across Poland and Germany suggested similar attrition rates. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners in motion across the crumbling Reich, leaving trails of corpses in their wake. The Führer's orders are to leave no one behind for the Soviets to liberate, Hoffman reminded his officers that morning. Every prisoner who dies on this march is one less witness to what occurred at Auschwitz. Remember that when you feel inclined toward misplaced compassion. By midday, Elias could barely remain upright. The dysentery had progressed, and he had not managed to retain water for over 24 hours. Dark spots floated across his vision, and his legs moved forward more from momentum than conscious control. His fever burned so hot that the freezing air felt almost pleasant against his skin, a dangerous sign that his body was losing its ability to regulate temperature. 3 prisoners near him had already succumbed to similar symptoms since morning. Dysentery spread quickly through the columns, the result of contaminated water sources and the complete absence of sanitation. The guards forced the columns to maintain pace regardless, shooting those who soiled themselves and fell behind. Medical evidence of this practice would later prove difficult for war crimes prosecutors to establish. The victims appeared to have died from disease rather than direct violence, exactly as the SS intended. "David," he whispered, his lips cracked and bleeding, "I need to rest, just for a moment." David looked around frantically. Stopping in the middle of the column meant death. Falling behind meant death. Every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. His mathematician's mind calculated probabilities with cold precision. Continuing meant 100% certainty of Elias's death within hours. Attempting escape offered perhaps a 5% chance of survival. Mathematics made the choice clear, even as emotion rebelled against the risk. "There," he whispered, pointing with his chin toward a small copse of trees about 50 yards from the road. "If we can reach it when the guards aren't looking." It was madness, of course. The chances of slipping away unnoticed were almost non-existent, but continuing meant certain death for Elias within hours, if not minutes. "Now!" David hissed suddenly, gripping Elias's arm and veering sharply left, away from the column. They stumbled through the snow, expecting at any moment to hear shouts or gunfire. None came. The guards at this section of the column had become lax, more concerned with their own discomfort in the cold than with maintaining perfect surveillance. They reached the trees and collapsed behind a fallen log, breathing heavily. The column continued its slow procession on the road, an unbroken line of misery that had momentarily released them from its grasp. The snow beneath them was deep, soaking through their thin uniforms, but the immediate threat of execution seemed temporarily abated. In the distance, they could hear occasional gunshots, guards eliminating prisoners who had fallen or attempted their own escapes. Elias curled into himself, racked by another spasm of pain. His body had nothing left to expel, yet the cramps continued, muscles contracting against emptiness. David cleared snow from the ground and pressed his palm against the frozen earth, then placed his cold hand against Elias's forehead, a primitive attempt to reduce fever with no medical supplies available. "I'm dying," Elias whispered, the words fogging briefly in the frigid air. It wasn't fear or drama that colored his statement, merely a factual observation delivered with the detachment of someone too exhausted for emotional response. "Not today," David replied with quiet determination. "Not here in these woods, not after everything." He removed his own threadbare jacket, despite the cold, and placed it over Elias's shivering form, an act that significantly reduced his own chances of survival, but reflected a calculus beyond mere mathematics. Some equations incorporated values that could not be quantified. Friendship, loyalty, the stubborn insistence that one person's life mattered in a world intent on erasing that truth. A twig snapped nearby. Both men froze, certain they had been discovered. Instead of an SS uniform, however, they saw a young woman in a heavy wool coat approaching cautiously through the trees. She held a finger to her lips and gestured for them to remain still. Hannah Berkowitz had been watching the column through binoculars when she spotted the two men breaking away. She had immediately recognized the opportunity and moved to intercept them before they could be discovered. Years of resistance work had taught her to move through forests silently, her steps carefully placed to avoid the telltale crack of breaking branches that might alert patrols. She approached the men with the caution of someone who had seen too many SS traps, prisoners deliberately allowed to escape, then followed to resistance hideouts. She observed them from behind a thick pine for several minutes, confirming there were no guards tracking them before making her presence known. "I'm with the resistance," she whispered in Polish, then switched to German when she saw their blank expressions. "If you can walk a little farther, we have a hiding place." David studied her face with the intensity of a man who had learned that trust was a luxury few could afford. Her clothes were civilian, a heavy wool coat, sturdy boots, knitted cap pulled low over dark hair. She carried no visible weapon, though the slight bulge under her left arm suggested a pistol in a shoulder holster. Most convincingly, she was alone. SS traps typically involved multiple personnel. Before the war, David had been renowned for his mathematical intuition, his ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. That same intuition now calculated risk with variables of life and death. He assessed Hannah's posture. Her eyes, the way she scanned their surroundings continuously, all suggesting genuine resistance experience rather than Gestapo training. The decisive factor was her hands. They were chapped and reddened from cold, but moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to outdoor survival. Gestapo agents, in his experience, had smoother hands and less practical competence. "He's very ill," David said finally, gesturing to Elias. "Dysentery, I think." Hannah's eyes softened slightly at the diagnosis. She had seen this before, the camp's final cruelty, turning the body against itself. She pulled a small flask from her coat pocket and unscrewed the cap. "Boiled water with charcoal and herbs," she explained. "It won't cure him, but it might help control the symptoms until we reach better medicine." She held the flask to Elias's cracked lips, supporting his head as he drank in small, painful sips. "The herbs are yarrow and peppermint," she added, speaking as much to distract them from their fear as to explain. "My grandmother taught me. She was a midwife in Krakow before the war." This small personal detail, unnecessary but freely offered, further convinced David of her authenticity. Imposters rarely volunteered information that couldn't be verified. As Elias drank, Hannah continued her vigilant scanning of the forest. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before they might notice you're missing from the column. Can you walk with assistance?" The question was directed at Elias, but her eyes moved to David, acknowledging that the decision was one they would make together. They moved through the forest for nearly an hour, taking a circuitous route to avoid German patrols. Elias stumbled frequently, and twice they had to stop while he vomited weakly into the snow. Finally, they reached a small hunting cabin so well concealed by surrounding pines that it was nearly invisible until they were upon it. The cabin was barely warmed by a tiny stove that could not be allowed to produce visible smoke, but after days in the open, it felt like paradise. A single kerosene lamp cast long shadows across rough wooden walls. In one corner, 3 men lay on pallets made from pine boughs covered with blankets. Other prisoners rescued from the death march the previous day. One had a crudely bandaged leg, the white fabric stained with seeping blood. Another stared vacantly at the ceiling, his eyes tracking movement only he could see, the 1,000-yard gaze of someone whose mind had retreated from unbearable reality. Tomasz Nowak was a former history teacher from Krakow, age 54, his once powerful frame now gaunt from years of near starvation while hiding in the forests. The resistance had become his classroom, and survival his curriculum. The scar bisecting his left eyebrow came from the butt of a German rifle during the initial invasion of Poland, a permanent reminder of the moment when academic theories about warfare collided with its bloody reality. His wife and daughters had been taken to Ravensbrück 2 years earlier. He had received no word of their fate, but harbored no illusions about their survival. Before the war, Tomasz had specialized in medieval Polish history, writing extensively on the cultural exchanges between Jewish and Christian communities in Krakow during the 14th century. The cruel irony of his current situation, witnessing the destruction of that centuries-long coexistence, was not lost on him. He had transformed from a chronicler of history to a participant in its darkest chapter, his academic detachment replaced by the urgent imperative of preserving lives that the Reich had deemed unworthy of existence. The resistance cell he led was small, but remarkably effective. They maintained 7 safe houses within a 20-mile radius, connected by forest paths, known only to trusted guides. They had developed a communication system using bird calls and marks on trees that German patrols consistently overlooked. Most crucially, they had cultivated a network of sympathetic farmers who provided food and information despite the risk of execution if discovered. When asked why they helped, most offered simple responses. Because they are human beings, Or what else could a decent person do? We can keep you here for 2 days at most, Tomasz explained as Hannah gave Elias a stronger mixture of charcoal and herbs to combat the dysentery. Then we must move you to another location. The Germans sweep these woods regularly. They bring dogs trained to track human scent. He gestured toward a crude map pinned to the cabin wall, marked with pencil notations indicating German patrol patterns. Tuesday and Friday they come from the north with dogs. Monday and Thursday from the west with larger units. We move between these times, always staying one step ahead. The systematic approach reflected his academic background, analyzing patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, developing countermeasures. This was history as it happened, not as it would later be written. He did not mention what they all knew, that anyone too ill to travel when the time came would need to be left behind. The resistance could not jeopardize an entire cell for one individual, no matter how painful the calculus of such decisions. This was the harsh arithmetic of survival under occupation, measuring lives against risk, weighing immediate compassion against long-term resistance. David nodded, too overwhelmed by this unexpected salvation to form words. For the first time in years, someone was helping them without expectation of labor or obedience. The simple humanity of it seemed almost foreign. Meanwhile, the death march continued westward. Lieutenant Hoffman noted the occasional disappearance of prisoners, but calculated that the percentage was acceptable given the overall attrition rate. By the time they reached Gross Rosen, they would deliver perhaps 4,000 of the original 10,000, a 60% loss, but still 4,000 workers for the Reich's war machine. What Hoffman could not know, was that his meticulous management of this mobile atrocity was being documented. Hannah Berkowitz's photographs would eventually reach Allied intelligence. Testimony from survivors like Elias and David would be recorded. The scattered trail of bodies would be discovered, exhumed, counted. The death marches represented the final phase of the Holocaust, a desperate attempt to conceal evidence and continue the machinery of genocide even as the Nazi regime collapsed. Between January and May of 1945, over 250,000 prisoners were force-marched from camps in the east. Historians estimate that at least 35,000 died on these marches, though the true number will never be known with certainty. Some scholars suggest the actual death toll may have exceeded 60,000 when accounting for undocumented killings, and bodies never recovered from forests, lakes, and remote areas. The death rate varied significantly by route and guard unit. On some marches, particularly those departing from camps in early February when temperatures reached their lowest point, survival rates dropped below 30%. The march from Stutthof to Lauenburg, conducted during a blizzard that lasted 4 days, resulted in the deaths of over 80% of the prisoners who began the journey. The geographic scope of these marches was staggering. Prisoners from camps in Poland walked as far as northern Germany and Austria, covering distances of up to 400 miles over weeks of forced marching. The routes often doubled back or circled aimlessly as SS commanders received conflicting orders from a Reich leadership in disarray. Some columns were marched directly into advancing Soviet forces through miscommunication or navigational error. Others were redirected multiple times, extending their ordeals as the collapsing German bureaucracy struggled to coordinate its final atrocities. SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl, head of the Economic and Administrative Main Office that oversaw the concentration camp system, issued the first formal orders for the death marches on January 6, 1945. The directive marked highest security classification, instructed camp commandants to evacuate all prisoners westward rather than allow their liberation by Allied forces. The order included the chillingly explicit instruction that no prisoner capable of naming names must fall into enemy hands alive. Still, Pohl would later claim at his Nuremberg trial that he had intended only the orderly evacuation of labor needed for the Reich's defense, but handwritten notes discovered in his personal papers told a different story. The final problem must be solved on the roads, he wrote to Heinrich Himmler, where attribution of individual deaths becomes impossible to prove. Wars. What distinguished the death marches from earlier phases of the Holocaust was their public nature. While the gas chambers and mass shootings had occurred in carefully isolated locations, the marches traversed populated areas, making the genocide visible to ordinary German civilians in unprecedented ways. Towns and villages along the routes could not claim ignorance of what passed before their windows. The columns of emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms, guarded by armed SS men, were unmistakable. Local residents observed the shooting of those who fell behind. They saw bodies left in ditches. They heard the gunshots. Testimony collected after the war revealed a wide spectrum of civilian responses. Some turned away and closed their curtains. Others watched with apparent indifference. A brave few attempted to throw food to prisoners or shelter escapees despite the risk of execution for such assistance. The town of Bad Tölz in Bavaria became infamous when residents complained to local authorities not about the killings themselves, but about corpses left in public view, requesting they be removed for aesthetic reasons. In contrast, the villagers of Reichertshofen risked collective punishment by leaving food bundles along the roadside at night and sheltering 7 escaped prisoners in their church. In Penzberg, a mining town south of Munich, spontaneous public resistance occurred when residents witnessed SS guards shooting prisoners too weak to continue marching. A group of miners confronted the guards, creating enough of a disturbance for 16 prisoners to escape into nearby woods. The following day, SS units returned to the town and publicly hanged 7 residents identified as ringleaders of the interference. This event, later known as the Penzberg murders, represented one of the few documented instances of organized German civilian opposition to the death marches. Wehrmacht soldier Hans Miller, captured by American forces near Munich, provided testimony about witnessing a death march intersect with German military retreat in late March. Our unit was moving west when we encountered a column of camp prisoners being marched in the same direction. The SS guards were shooting stragglers without pause, sometimes 10 or 15 in an hour. Our commanding officer requested that they move their prisoners to secondary roads, as the bodies were impeding our military vehicles. There was no discussion about stopping the killings, only about the logistical inconvenience they created for our retreat. That night, I saw a young SS man, no more than 18, shooting prisoners who had collapsed from exhaustion. He was laughing as he did it, calling it target practice. When he ran out of ammunition, he began using his rifle as a club. I remember one lieutenant joking that the SS was cluttering the highway with their garbage. That night, I deserted, unable to continue serving a cause that had descended to such depravity. German military records captured after the war revealed that resources critical to the increasingly desperate military situation, fuel, vehicles, personnel, were diverted to support the death marches until the final days of the Reich. This prioritization of genocide over tactical military needs provides some of the clearest evidence of the fundamental nature of Nazi ideology. The extermination of Jews and other undesirables was not a secondary objective but a core purpose of the regime, one they pursued even at the cost of their own military survival. Elias Friedman survived his illness, protected by the Polish resistance until Soviet forces swept through the area 3 weeks later. The medicine Hannah provided, supplemented by a local healer's knowledge of traditional remedies, gradually restored his body's ability to retain fluids. Recovery was slow and painful. Twice he nearly died as fever spiked, and his weakened heart struggled to continue beating. David remained by his side throughout, reading aloud from a tattered copy of Pushkin's poetry found in the cabin, keeping Elias's mind engaged even as his body fought for each breath. The resistance moved them 4 times during those weeks, staying ahead of German patrols that grew increasingly desperate and violent as Soviet forces pushed westward. Each hideout was more primitive than the last. A woodcutter's shed, an abandoned root cellar, a cave whose entrance was concealed by dense undergrowth. Food grew scarcer as supply lines were disrupted by the fighting. Sometimes a day passed with nothing but melted snow and pine needle tea to sustain them. David Katz remained with him, honoring their pact to the end, though the opportunity to separate and improve his own chances arose more than once. Mathematics is about patterns, he explained to Hannah one night, as they kept vigil over Elias during a particularly bad spell. And the pattern of my life has always moved toward this moment, this choice to remain. To calculate otherwise would violate the fundamental theorem of my existence. There were moments during those weeks when David questioned his decision, not because he regretted staying with Elias, but because he wondered if his companion might have received better care had David been captured or killed. Resources were desperately limited in the resistance hideouts. Every mouthful of food given to one person meant less for others. Every minute spent treating Elias was time not spent helping someone else. The moral mathematics of survival created impossible equations with no correct solutions. On the 7th day after their escape, German patrols came within 50 yards of the abandoned woodcutter's hut where they were hiding. They could hear dogs barking, officers shouting commands, boots crunching through underbrush. The 4 escaped prisoners and 2 resistance members inside held their breath. Knowing discovery meant certain death. Elias, delirious with fever, had to be physically restrained and his mouth covered to prevent him from moaning loudly enough to be heard. For 6 hours they remained frozen in place, muscles cramping, bladders painfully full, until the search moved to another sector. That night, Tomasz made the decision to split their group. 3 would move north toward Soviet lines, while David, Elias, and Hannah would continue west, where American forces were reported to be advancing more rapidly. The smaller the group, the better the chances, Tomasz explained, his logic unassailable, but his eyes revealing the emotional cost of such calculations. Each separation might be final, each goodbye potentially the last. This was the texture of life in the shadow of systematic extermination. Every human connection simultaneously precious and dangerous, every attachment both essential for survival and a potential liability. Together, They made their way, eventually to Palestine, traveling first with a group of displaced persons through Soviet-controlled territories, then via an overcrowded ship that nearly sank during a storm in the Mediterranean. The British authorities intercepted their vessel off the coast of Haifa, but they managed to slip ashore during the confusion of disembarkation. The journey took nearly 2 years, with long stays in displaced persons camps in Italy and Cyprus, where conditions sometimes eerily echoed the Nazi camps they had escaped. Overcrowded, undersupplied, surrounded by barbed wire, their fate determined by distant bureaucrats who viewed them as statistics rather than individuals, both lived to see the establishment of Israel. Both bore the physical and psychological scars of their experience until death. Elias's digestive system never fully recovered, and David experienced nightmares so severe they often left him unable to sleep more than 2 hours consecutively. Neither ever returned to Europe, though they received multiple invitations to testify at war crimes trials or speak at Holocaust remembrance events. Europe is a graveyard, Elias explained when declining an invitation to speak at the opening of a Holocaust museum in Berlin in 1992. I have no desire to walk among its tombstones. Their lives in Israel followed different but complementary paths. Elias eventually resumed his watchmaking trade, opening a small shop in Tel Aviv that became known for its meticulous restorations of timepieces damaged during the war. Survivors would bring him watches that had belonged to murdered family members, timepieces that had stopped during arrests or deportations, mechanisms clogged with the dust of ghettos or the mud of camps. Elias restored each one with reverent care, understanding that these objects represented more than mere possessions. They were tangible connections to erased lives, physical embodiments of continuity in the face of rupture. He never charged for these restorations. Some work is not business, he would say simply. Some work is sacred. David's return to academic life was more complicated. The University of Jerusalem offered him a position based on his pre-war reputation, but he found himself unable to engage with pure mathematics as he once had. The abstract beauty of numbers that had once been his passion now seemed disconnected from the brutal realities he had witnessed. "How can I contemplate the elegant symmetry of prime number distributions," he wrote in his journal, "when I have counted bodies in ditches?" His work took an unexpected turn in the 1960s when he began applying statistical analysis to Holocaust testimony, developing methodologies to extract historically reliable information from traumatized memory. The traditional historical method had privileged written documents over oral testimony, particularly when witness accounts contained inconsistencies or impossibilities common to traumatic memory. David's innovative approach used statistical patterns across multiple testimonies to identify core truths, even when individual accounts contained elements shaped by trauma or time. The two men lived within walking distance of each other in Tel Aviv, meeting weekly for coffee in a small cafe near the sea. They rarely spoke about the camps or the march in these meetings, focusing instead on present concerns, the politics of the new state, developments in their respective fields, the progress of the children they eventually adopted and raised. Yet the experience remained a gravitational center around which their lives orbited, invisible but immensely powerful, shaping every decision and relationship. They had survived, but survival itself was complex, not simply the continuation of biological life, but the ongoing negotiation with memories that could never be fully integrated or forgotten. Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann did not survive the war. As Soviet forces overran Gross Rosen in February, he attempted to flee westward but was captured by American troops near Dresden in April. His initial processing went smoothly. He had discarded his SS uniform for civilian clothes and claimed to be a displaced university administrator. The false identification papers he carried identified him as Karl Heinz, a mathematics professor from the University of Leipzig. He spoke excellent English, having spent a year at Oxford before the war, and his cultured manner impressed the young American lieutenant who first interviewed him. The Americans, overwhelmed with prisoners and refugees, might have accepted this story had it not been for the arrival of 3 former Auschwitz inmates at the same processing center. The chaos of the final months of war had created strange convergences, throwing perpetrators and victims together in ways the Germans had never anticipated. The meticulous Nazi record-keeping system that had documented millions of deaths now betrayed its administrators as they attempted to disappear into the anonymous mass of displaced Europeans. Joseph Kleinman, a Dutch Jew who had survived both the camp and the death march, recognized Hoffmann immediately despite the civilian disguise. The moment occurred in the camp's central processing area. Kleinman was registering for repatriation to the Netherlands when he saw the profile of the man who had once selected him for a punishment detail that nearly killed him. The recognition was instant and visceral. Kleinman vomited from the shock of seeing his tormentor standing free, filling out paperwork as if he were just another refugee. That man ordered hundreds shot. he told the American officers through an interpreter, his hands shaking so violently he could barely point. He made us remove shoes from corpses in the snow. He selected who would live and who would die with the flick of a finger. 2 other survivors corroborated Kleinman's account. Sarah Eckstein, originally from Vienna, identified a distinctive scar on Hoffman's right hand that she remembered from the selection process at Auschwitz. Jacob Brodsky, a Polish tailor, described with perfect accuracy the manner in which Hoffman would tap his riding crop against his boot when contemplating which prisoner to shoot as an example to others who worked too slowly. The level of detail in these independent accounts convinced American intelligence officers to investigate further. Military intelligence officers searched Hoffman and discovered a small notebook hidden in the lining of his coat, meticulously maintained records of prisoner transfers that implicated him directly in the death marches. The notebook contained not just administrative details, but personal observations that revealed his mindset. Test of new method, successful. Read one entry from January 20th. Forced standing in stream for 10 minutes. Results in quick death by evening without visible trauma. Recommended for wider implementation. Additionally, he carried false identification papers for Argentina and Brazil, obtained through contacts in the rat lines that the Reich had established to help high-ranking Nazis escape Europe after defeat. While awaiting transfer to a detention facility for war criminals, he was placed in a cell with 2 other suspected SS officers. The American military police had limited facilities for housing the flood of detainees being processed, necessitating shared cells, despite security protocols that should have isolated high-value prisoners. Hoffman's cellmates were Werner Schmidt, his former adjutant captured 3 days earlier, and Otto Kraus, an SS Hauptsturmführer from the Dachau administration. The 3 men spoke little during their first day of confinement, each assessing the others and the changing dynamics of their situation. On the second night, April 17th, guards conducting routine checks at 2300 hours found Hoffman dead on the cell floor. A bootlace wrapped tightly around his neck, his face discolored from asphyxiation. Schmidt and Kraus claimed to have been asleep, awakened only by the guards' entry. The official investigation was cursory at best. American military resources were stretched thin, and the death of an SS officer generated minimal concern among authorities, processing thousands of displaced persons and POWs daily. Official reports indicate he committed suicide in his cell using a shoelace. The investigators noted that high-ranking Nazi officials often chose suicide over capture, citing the precedents of Heinrich Himmler, who had bitten a cyanide capsule during British interrogation, and countless others who preferred death to facing justice. The report suggested Hoffman had recognized the inevitability of his execution once his identity and actions were confirmed, choosing to end his life on his own terms. Unofficial accounts suggest his death may not have been self-inflicted. 3 former prisoners who worked as translators for the American forces were seen near his cell shortly before guards discovered his body. Joseph Kleinman, the Dutch survivor who had identified Hoffman, had been assisting military intelligence officers with interrogations of captured SS personnel. He had unrestricted access to the detention facility's administrative section, adjacent to the cells. The overnight guard, Private Thomas Anderson from Milwaukee, later acknowledged in a 1978 interview that he had been elsewhere in the compound for approximately 40 minutes during the crucial time frame, a violation of protocol he had never previously admitted. No investigation into the circumstances was ever conducted beyond the initial determination of suicide. The case file was closed within 24 hours. The body cremated rather than returned to Germany, as was standard procedure for POWs, and Hoffman's personal effects, including the damning notebook, disappeared from the evidence lockup. Whatever justice was administered that night remained unofficial, unrecorded, and outside the formal mechanisms of military law. One final death among millions, distinguished only by the possibility that victims, rather than perpetrators, may have determined its timing. Hannah Berkowitz continued her resistance work until liberation. The final weeks before Soviet forces arrived were perhaps the most dangerous. SS units, knowing their defeat was imminent, became increasingly savage in their treatment of civilians and suspected resistance members. Twice, she narrowly escaped capture during raids on villages suspected of harboring Jews or partisans. Once she hid for 18 hours in the hollow trunk of a fallen oak, while German shepherds and their handlers searched the surrounding forest. So close, she could hear the dogs sniffing and the guards discussing which local women they would visit after completing their patrol. In early February, Hannah and 3 other resistance members succeeded in their most daring operation, the infiltration of a temporary SS headquarters established in a manor house near the former Death March route. The mission had been conceived after they received intelligence from a sympathetic Polish cleaner that senior officers were gathering to coordinate the continued westward movement of prisoners and the systematic destruction of evidence. The resistance cell spent 5 days preparing, studying the manor's layout from a distance, noting guard rotations, identifying vulnerabilities. 2 members of the group had worked as household staff in similar estates before the war. providing crucial insights into service entrances and internal corridors. Hannah memorized the exact mannerisms of the local women who delivered laundry to the estate, the slightly hunched posture, the deference expressed through lowered eyes, the shuffling gait designed to appear non-threatening to German authorities. On February 4th, disguised as cleaning staff, Hannah and Magda Wojcik entered through the service entrance carrying baskets of linens. Their forged work papers survived cursory inspection by a guard more interested in leering at Magda than examining their documentation. Once inside, they separated according to plan. Magda would create a distraction in the kitchen if needed, while Hannah made her way to the officers' meeting room, supposedly to dust and straighten. The risk was extraordinary. Discovery meant certain torture and execution. Hannah had swallowed a small cyanide capsule before entering, not in her mouth where it might be discovered, but in her stomach, where stomach acid would eventually dissolve the coating if she were captured and detained for more than a few hours. Death was preferable to what SS interrogators would inflict on a Jewish resistance member. With her heart pounding so loudly she feared the guards might hear it, Hannah dusted the meeting room with deliberate slowness, memorizing the location of documents spread across the large oak table. When the officers departed for lunch in the dining hall, leaving only a single guard at the door, she seized her opportunity. The camera, taken from her Leica and reassembled inside a hollowed-out scrub brush, emerged from her cleaning supplies. With fingers steady despite her terror, she photographed document after document, turning pages silently, replacing each exactly as she found it. The materials revealed the full administrative apparatus behind the death marches, not panicked evacuations, but carefully orchestrated mobile killing operations. One directive, signed by Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler himself, specified that the elimination of witnesses must be accelerated through natural means, a euphemism for the deliberate exposure, starvation, and exhaustion that characterized the marches. Another document detailed efficiency metrics for different guard units, with commendations for those achieving the highest prisoner death rates while maintaining plausible deniability of direct murder. Her photographs became evidence in war crimes trials and are now preserved in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. The images capture not just the physical horror of emaciated bodies in snow, but also the bureaucratic machinery that enabled mass murder. Officers consulting clipboards, guards dividing prisoners into groups for execution, the methodical disposal of corpses. One particularly haunting image shows a young SS officer smiling for his comrade's camera while standing over a freshly dug mass grave, a moment of casual depravity that prosecutors would later use to demonstrate the complete moral collapse within the Nazi hierarchy. The photographs almost didn't survive the war. In March of 1945, the farmhouse where Hannah had hidden several rolls of film was destroyed during an artillery exchange between retreating German forces and advancing Soviets. She frantically dug through the smoldering ruins, suffering second-degree burns on her hands, to recover the metal box containing the negatives. Later that month, she was nearly captured at a checkpoint while carrying 2 rolls of film sewn into the lining of her coat. A German shepherd detected her scent, not the film, but the residual chemical odors of development fluid on her hands. The handler interpreted the dog's interest as sexual attraction to a female and laughed it off, unknowingly allowing crucial evidence of war crimes to pass through. When Soviet forces finally secured the region in late April, Hannah faced a new dilemma. Soviet counterintelligence officers, the NKVD, were suspicious of civilians with cameras and film, particularly those who had operated behind German lines without capture. Her Jewish identity offered some protection, but her possession of Western-made photographic equipment raised questions about possible connections to British intelligence. A sympathetic Red Army officer, who had lost family in Ukrainian pogroms, helped her hide the most sensitive materials until she could make contact with American journalists in June. She emigrated to America in 1947, arriving at Ellis Island with nothing but a small suitcase containing her cameras and negatives. The immigration officer who processed her papers noticed the tattooed numbers on her forearm. She had been briefly imprisoned in Majdanek before her escape, and waved her through with unusual gentleness, whispering, "Welcome to America," in carefully practiced Yiddish. In New York, she found work with the Photo League, a cooperative of socially conscious photographers documenting urban life and labor conditions. Her technical skills and unflinching eye for human truth quickly earned her assignments with major publications, though she never revealed the full extent of her wartime photography to colleagues, finding the intersection of professional photography and personal trauma too complex to navigate in casual workplace conversations. The snow eventually melted along the routes of the death marches, revealing the full extent of the horror that had transpired. Local villagers, Allied soldiers, and Soviet forces discovered bodies in roadside ditches, in fields, in shallow graves hastily dug by SS guards attempting to conceal the scale of death. In one particularly grim discovery near the town of Wodzisław Śląski, a farmer plowing his field in April uncovered the remains of 87 prisoners who had been executed and buried in a single pit. The bodies were still dressed in striped uniforms, many with hands bound behind their backs, evidence that contradicted official German claims that deaths on the marches were primarily due to exposure and illness rather than deliberate execution. Soviet pathologists conducted autopsies on hundreds of recovered bodies, documenting cause of death with clinical precision. Their findings revealed the variety of killing methods employed during the marches: gunshot wounds to the base of the skull, the preferred SS method for individual executions, blunt force trauma from rifle butts, strangulation, and in some cases, evidence of live burial. They also noted the extreme malnutrition present in virtually all victims, bodies so devoid of fat and muscle that they barely resembled human forms, weights averaging between 60 and 80 pounds for adult men. These autopsy reports would later serve as crucial evidence in war crimes trials, though many of the most damning Soviet documents remained classified until the 1990s due to Cold War politics. American forces liberating the region around Dachau in late April 1945 encountered perhaps the most disturbing evidence of the Death March's final phase. As German defeat became certain, SS units had forced remaining prisoners to dig mass graves, execute fellow inmates, and then burn documentation before the guards themselves fled. Lieutenant Robert Weiss of the 42nd Infantry Division described the scene in his official report. The road leading to the camp was littered with bodies in various states of decomposition. Most victims appeared to have been shot while attempting to sit or lie down, indicating they were killed for inability to continue marching. We encountered a group of approximately 200 survivors who had been abandoned in a barn 3 days prior with no food or water. They reported that their guards had simply disappeared during the night after executing 30 prisoners deemed too weak to continue onward. Many survivors were in such advanced stages of starvation that our medical personnel advised against immediate full feeding for fear of shock to their systems. But not all were forgotten. Survivors like Elias and David carried their memories forward, testifying to what they had endured and witnessed. They spoke for those who could not speak, remembered those who would otherwise be forgotten, and in doing so, they transformed their survival from mere biological persistence into an act of resistance against the machinery of erasure that had claimed so many. The death marches represent not just the final chapter of the Holocaust, but a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. In every footprint left in that blood-stained snow, in every act of mutual aid between prisoners, in every risk taken by resistors like Hannah and Tomasz, we find evidence that even in the darkest moments of history, humanity persists. Perhaps the most profound legacy of these events lies not in the historical record of atrocity, but in how we choose to respond to that knowledge. The death marches occurred in public view, along highways and through villages, witnessed by thousands of civilians who later claimed ignorance or helplessness. This public dimension forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about collective responsibility, about the choice between bearing witness and turning away, about what ordinary people might do when confronted with extraordinary evil. Some witnesses chose action despite overwhelming risk. Maria Kowalczyk, a Polish farmer's wife, left buckets of water along the roadside for marching prisoners despite SS prohibitions. When questioned by guards, she claimed she had left them for her cows. Her small deception saved dozens from death by dehydration. Father Maximilian Reichert, a Catholic priest in Bavaria, sheltered 17 escaped prisoners in his church basement for 3 weeks until American forces arrived, sharing the church's meager food rations and tending to the ill despite knowing that discovery meant execution. Both acted from a moral clarity that transcended fear, with the recognition that witnessing atrocity creates an obligation to respond, however limited that response might be. In 2008, archaeologists excavating along a former death march route near the German-Polish border made a remarkable discovery. In a shallow grave containing the remains of 23 prisoners, they found a tin Star of David, crudely fashioned from what appeared to be a food container. Inside was a small scrap of paper with names written in minute handwriting, presumably the identities of those buried there, recorded by the last survivor before his own death. The paper had survived more than 6 decades, preserved in its makeshift metal container, waiting to restore names to those who were meant to die anonymously. The names were compared to camp records, and 18 families finally learned the fate of their long-missing relatives. Modern Germany has established over 100 memorials along death march routes, small stone markers, museums, preserved mass graves, creating a topography of remembrance that inscribes this history into the landscape itself. School groups walk portions of these routes as part of their education, trying to comprehend through physical experience what documents and photographs can only partially convey. These memorial walks represent a nation's attempt to confront its history not through abstraction, but through embodied understanding, placing feet where victims once walked, feeling a fraction of their exhaustion, sensing how distance itself became a weapon of extermination, For the few remaining survivors, now in their 90s or beyond, time has not diminished the clarity of their memories. Sarah Grossman, who survived a death march from Stutthof at age 16, spoke at a memorial dedication in 2019. Now 91, she moved slowly to the podium with the aid of a walker. A stark contrast to the forced march of 75 years earlier. People ask why I keep telling this story when it brings such pain, she told the assembled crowd. I tell it because I made a promise to those who fell beside me. If you live, they whispered as they died, tell what happened here. So I live, and I tell, and in this telling they are not erased. Their suffering was real, their deaths were real, their names were real. Remember them. In the end, what the Nazis did on the death marches was not just kill bodies, but attempt to kill memory itself. To erase not just lives, but the evidence that those lives had ever existed. That they failed in this larger objective represents perhaps the most meaningful victory of all. The death marches remain one of history's darkest chapters, but within that darkness, the persistent light of witness continues to illuminate our understanding of both what humans are capable of inflicting and what they are capable of enduring.